church media officially only appeals to 6% of its audience, and the journalists that work for them come from the top 1% of the population. So how is the mainstream media mainstream at all? Hello there, you 5.7 million awakening wonders. If you don't subscribe yet, subscribe now and turn on the notification bell, because I need to keep you informed of our daily videos so we can continue on this voyage towards the great light from which we came together. Now, have you become a bit sick and tired of the old mainstream media? Their constant lying, berating, telling you you're thick, dumb, racist, toxic, whatever it is this week? Well, there's a reason they talk about you that way, and that's because they're not talking to you. The mainstream media only cares about 6% of the total audience. I spoke to Batya Ungar-Sargon on my podcast Under the Skin, available from Luminary, about how the mainstream media has become so corrupted, has become so irrelevant, has become so out of touch. It was an absolutely fantastic conversation. Stay to the end and hit me up in the comments, because there's some fantastic revelations in this video that you need to know.
Batya, I think you talk a lot about how all news media outlets are trying to appeal to the same limited demographic. Could you tell us a bit about that, please?
Yeah, definitely. The golden age of American journalism, let's say like, the 18th century, 19th century, and early 20th century, you had the media was totally partisan. So this is a thing that I think people like to complain that our media is partisan. Actually, that it's becoming more like the UK, where every publication has a kind of political bent and everybody knows what that is, and you get the paper that appeals to you. But in the golden age of American media, the media was very, very partisan. It was just partisan on behalf of the masses. So you would have a situation like 1920s New York, where there were so many communist newspapers that you could be a communist and have 5 communist newspapers that you would never dream of opening because they were the wrong kind of communists, right? Like that was the situation. There were so many working class Americans, and they had such a plethora of choices. And being a journalist, it used to be like this very working class trade, like the kind of person who became a journalist was like, actually probably someone like you, the guy sitting in the back of the classroom who can't stop cracking wise, who has like a real way with words and hates authority, and like the teacher's constantly kicking him out, and like, but he's so great, he makes everybody laugh, and he feels like it's like, yeah, that's why I was put in this classroom, is to give this teacher a hard time because fuck him, who gave him power over me, right? And he was so anti-authoritarian, maybe he had terrible parents, that he couldn't go work in the factory because he couldn't listen to directions, and he would have been dangerous to everybody around him. So instead of going to the factory like everybody else in his class, he would become a journalist, right? And when he went to be a journalist, he would be introduced to politicians, and he would be exactly the same way he was in that classroom. He would think it was his job to defy that authority and demand justice on behalf of the little guy that he lived with, that he still lived in those communities. That was like most of American journalism. But that same thing that happened those last 50 years, where Democrats started, they abandoned the working class, they started to rise economically with that tide of that economy they built that's really good for people in knowledge industry jobs. Journalists started to become more and more highly educated. They started to make more and more money. And now they're really in the top 10, but you really have to come from money to even become a journalist here. Actually, in the UK, it's even worse. It's like the top 2% or something, but you have to go to these really fancy schools. You have to take all these unpaid internships. So if you're working your way through college, you can forget about it. The New York Times, NPR, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, these people take their interns from the top 1% of universities. And there's no more local news. It sort of disappeared, right? So the class of journalists became like, there was just a status revolution. They went from being the little guy demanding justice from the powerful to part of the powerful. They go to school with the people who end up being politicians that they cover. They live in the same neighborhoods and all this stuff. And at the same time, the digital media, the way that digital media works is the way you measure success. I mean, you know this from your show, but is in terms of engagement, right? How many people were engaged? And, it's something probably you also have noticed is like the most engaged people are always the most extreme. So if you're the New York Times, you suddenly have this like overeducated elite class of journalists, but you want to be catering to the kids they went to school with who are now living in the same expensive cities because their data is the data that, matters, that they can sell, that they can make a profit off of. Oh, luckily for them, they know exactly how to appeal to them and how to appeal to their emotions because their newsroom is made up of that exact same class. And so when you used to have the situation where a newspaper, let's say you'd have a town that was like 50% Democrats, 50% Republicans, right? And then you had one newspaper in this town, right? So this newspaper, right, let's say in the 70s, right, before the big sorting, the guy who owned that paper, he could make a choice. I could let my journalists report the news in a lefty version, right? And get all of the Democrats, but then I lose 50% of the townsfolk. If I report the news straight and have a balanced editorial page, I can get the whole town to read my paper. Today in digital media, it's the exact opposite. They don't want any of those other readers and viewers. They only want the 6% of Americans who are progressives, who are affluent, who are living in these coastal cities. It's very targeted. And because digital media allows you to see who everybody is, who's reading you, and your journalists know how to get their emotions going because they know what makes them emotional. It was like this sort of marriage between a new profit motive and then a journalistic class that was uniquely situated to talk to those people.
Well, that's fascinating. Thank you. Also, though, that as you described that, Batya, it became clear that when you get to the data capture part of that, that is again how the economic imperatives bias the reporting of the news, and also though how it's led to an inaccurate understanding of American, let's say, cultural life, because if you read these newspapers, if you watch these TV shows, you might feel that this is the cultural temperature, but actually it's a very small subset. So I suppose that what that suggests to me is that there is when you talk about latent power, that this latent power ultimately is a psychic and spiritual phenomena that you're dealing with. The energy of individuals, the attention of individuals, the potential ability of individuals galvanized and motivated by a relevant ideology to transition out of one set of social ideals and into a new set of social ideals. It seems that there's been a sort of in a sense, referring to the earlier part of our conversation, a sort of a cultural coup in terms of the kind of a linguistic alteration and cultural paraphernalia that phatically represents a set of ideals within this sort of movement of progressivism. Again, to reiterate, when it comes to actual racial, gender, equality, these are ideas that I'm of course supportive of, but I've always been cynical about the deployment of these ideas in corporate and media spaces, in the same way that I don't think that Unilever particularly care about green issues and climate change, but that they will utilize these ideas where convenient. When it comes to rebooting, awakening a dormant class that previously had, as you say, 5 communist newspapers to choose from, and a sort of a somewhat robust social democratic political movement, and even media class, to now a situation where they're unrepresented, ignored, or demonized at best. What kind of political movement do you think is required to reawaken them, given that the most recent examples appear to be sort of ethno-nationalist movements, or at least they've been rendered as such as, Trump, for an obvious example, Brexit in our country, and even in countries like India with Modi or whatever that dude's called, where sort of like these retroactive kind of nationalist ideas are reawakened precisely because they probably have a sort of a nostalgic tug that the progressivism by its nature cannot incorporate. What do you think would be a more legitimate manifesto, or what would be pieces of a legitimate manifesto that might reawaken this dormant class?
Well, So we're very lucky in America because this country was founded on an idea rather than an ethnicity.
Well, what do you think? Does that make sense to you? Are things becoming a little clearer now? It's certainly most illuminating for me. If you want to listen to the rest of that conversation, you can hear it on Luminary, where my podcast Under the Skin currently is. If you enjoyed that conversation, please watch either of these and please sign up to my mailing list right now so I can keep you informed of all the events I'm doing and talk to you about stuff that I'd never mention on this platform. More important than any of that is that you please stay free.